"You don't belong in first class. Move to the back before I call security," snapped flight attendant Sarah Mitchell, her tone loud, clipped, and condescending enough to hush the chatter of boarding passengers. She didn't care that Amara Johnson stood there with a paid boarding pass in hand, dressed in a tailored navy pantsuit that practically shouted executive presence. To Sarah, she was just another woman who didn't look the part. And that meant one thing: she didn't belong. Moments later, her co-worker Emily Carter chimed in with a sneer. "This isn't your place. People like you usually sit farther back." The cabin fell quiet. A few gasps could be heard. A white male passenger seated in 1C smirked and said loud enough for the row to hear, "She's not first-class material anyway." That man, Richard Hayes, would soon learn just how wrong he was. Before we go any further, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. If you've ever been judged before anyone knew your name, this story is for you. Subscribe for more real stories that demand accountability. And if you're tired of injustice, hit that like button. Now let's get into it. It was early afternoon at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, one of the busiest terminals in the country, and Amara Johnson, 42 years old, Atlanta native, and a respected senior executive, was flying out for a high-stakes business meeting in Chicago. She wasn't traveling for leisure, and this wasn't her first time flying first class. She had booked seat 2A through the airline's mobile app and paid in full. Her husband, David, couldn't join her. He had meetings of his own, but she had made the trip countless times before and knew the routine. As she stepped into the aircraft cabin, she offered a polite smile to the crew and rolled her carry-on quietly down the aisle. That's when she first noticed the man in 1C giving her a strange look, the kind that lingered a little too long. She didn't think much of it, until she reached her seat and began to stow her bag. Without warning, Sarah Mitchell approached, blonde, early 30s, with a clipboard in hand and a performative smile that faded fast. "Excuse me, ma'am. You need to head back. That seat isn't for you." Amara blinked, confused. "I'm sorry?" she asked calmly. Sarah's smile dropped entirely. "You need to take your seat in economy. You're affecting our VIP." Amara held up her boarding pass, which clearly read, "Seat 2A." "I'm in the right place," she said evenly. Then Emily Carter walked over, brunette, about the same age, eyes scanning Amara like she was a problem that needed fixing. "There must be a mistake," Emily said coldly. "This section is reserved for our premium guests," Amara repeated. "I am a premium guest." But by now, Richard Hayes had gotten involved. "Come on," he muttered. "This is ridiculous. She's clearly in the wrong spot. I paid for peace and quiet, not this." The tone, the implication, it landed like a slap, sitting a few rows back. A fellow passenger named Michael Chen noticed the commotion. A 38-year-old tech consultant from California. He instinctively pulled out his phone and started recording. His voice could be heard on the video later titled, "Black Woman Denied First Class Seat," saying, "She paid for that seat. I saw her boarding pass." Amara stood still, breathing through the sting of public embarrassment. She didn't want to make a scene, but the scene had already been made for her. And worse, the crew was doubling down. "You're disturbing guests," Emily insisted. "You need to move before we call security." Sarah stepped closer. "This is your last warning." Amara pulled out her phone and quietly stepped to the side. She dialed one number, her husband David. Her voice trembled, but only slightly. "They're humiliating me," she said. "They told me I don't belong up here. David, they're trying to force me to move." David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Stay where you are," he told her. "I'm on my way." Meanwhile, Michael's video began circulating on TikTok. It started with 1,000 views within the first hour. The caption, Skyward Airlines, first-class racism caught on camera. Laura Bennett, another passenger seated in first class. 42, white woman, New York-born and well-dressed, stood up in Amara's defense. She belongs here, Laura said firmly, staring down Sarah. You don't get to decide who looks first class. Back at Amara's seat, things got worse. Sarah now claimed the ticket was invalid. Amara, calm but clearly shaken, handed it over. Scan it again. Sarah fumbled with her tablet, then whispered something to Emily, who replied, She doesn't look the part. Just switch her. That wasn't whispered enough. Michael caught it on video. Laura overheard it, and Amara, still holding her phone, whispered into it. They're lying. David, they just said I don't look like I belong. From a few rows back. Richard Hayes folded his arms, satisfied. Told you she was out of place, he said. Another passenger glared at him. You don't even know her. Someone snapped. Richard just shrugged. Don't need to. First class used to mean something. And just like that, what started as a quiet moment of boarding turned into something much bigger. Michael's video, now surging toward 5,000 views, had captured everything: the smug remarks, the dismissive tones, the silent disbelief from nearby passengers who didn't speak but definitely watched. Amara remained composed, even as she was told, again, to leave. I paid for this seat, she repeated. I'm not going anywhere. When asked later why she didn't simply move to avoid conflict, Amara said, because giving in would have told every person watching that silence was the safest choice. And it's not. Not anymore. The injustice was plain. The damage, already done. And in the next 10 minutes, someone in a suit and tie would walk onto that plane and turn the entire situation on its head. Someone who knew exactly who Amara Johnson was, because he was her husband, and the CEO of the very airline now on the brink of public outrage. Amara stayed rooted to the floor as if her shoes were bolted down, her boarding pass still gripped in one hand and her phone in the other. Sarah's voice grew more clipped, more performative, as if she were now acting for the few watching passengers instead of listening to reason. You are causing a disturbance, she said, projecting her voice toward the front row as though trying to create a case against Amara in real time. Emily, standing just behind her, crossed her arms and added, You're holding up service. People are getting anxious. Behind them, Richard Hayes, still lounging in 1C like he owned the entire aircraft, muttered under his breath. Told you, she's not our kind. I don't know what she's even doing here. The words made Amara's stomach turn, not because she was surprised, she wasn't, but because of how casual he made it sound, like he'd said it 100 times before. Michael Chen, now standing by his seat with his phone still recording, said loud enough for everyone to hear. This is unfair. She paid for that seat. The video was picking up steam fast, already nearing 100,000 views, and the words, Skyward's bias exposed, were front and center in every frame. Laura Bennett, still seated in 3A but visibly shaken, looked directly at Sarah and asked, Are you really going to remove a woman with a paid ticket just because one man doesn't like how she looks? Amara, still on the phone, whispered again, David, they're escalating. They're trying to paint me as the problem. Please hurry. The energy in the cabin was tight, like everyone knew they were watching something that wasn't just wrong. It was deeply familiar, the kind of moment people had experienced in boardrooms, hotel lobbies, schools, and store counters. Something unspoken and systemic, playing out like a bad rerun. Laura overheard Emily say quietly to Sarah, We're supposed to prioritize the VIP-looking guests. Then glanced around like she realized she'd said too much. Laura's mouth dropped slightly. Training told you that? She asked. Shocked. Emily stiffened. Sarah avoided the question entirely and looked back at Amara with the same stone face. You need to take your assigned seat, or we'll be forced to remove you. Amara's voice didn't shake. I am in my assigned seat, she replied, and I'm not moving. For Amara, this wasn't unfamiliar territory. Years earlier, at 35, she'd been denied a promotion she was more than qualified for, 3 times, by a company that never said, it's your race, but never had to. She'd learned early that looking calm, sounding measured, and showing up twice as prepared was the minimum price for being taken half as seriously. That training kicked in again now. Her voice was steady, but her heart was pounding. The humiliation wasn't just personal, it was surgical, like they knew how to chip away at dignity without ever raising their voices. Michael leaned toward Sarah. I'm telling you right now, this is going viral. This is discrimination. Amara nodded, then said directly to Sarah, check my ticket again, scan it properly, prove I don't belong here, Laura added. You have no right to treat her this way. Sarah, arms folded, just said, this is a first-class cabin. We have standards. Emily chimed in again. You're disrupting the boarding process. Amara, phone still in hand, turned slightly and said, they're humiliating both of us. David, Michael added, this isn't new. These stories are everywhere. Laura looked toward the other rows. Are we all just going to watch this happen? The passengers grew tense, and not just the ones in first class. Word was trickling back to economy, where murmurs started to build. A woman near the curtain whispered to her husband, why are they treating her like she doesn't belong? A man in row 14 leaned forward to get a look. Someone else had already opened their TikTok app and found Michael's video. The views were doubling by the minute. Amara stood her ground. You've scanned my ticket. I paid full price. I followed every rule. What else do I need to do? Look different? Laura echoed her. This is blatant profiling. Michael stepped up. She belongs here more than some of the people complaining about her. Emily's face turned red. You're making this worse, she snapped. Turn off your phone. Richard Hayes leaned over again, practically enjoying himself now, and said, just get her out. We've got a flight to catch. Amara didn't flinch. You're lying. David, she whispered again, this time louder. They're trying to push me out, and they're acting like I'm the threat, Sarah said. You're delaying us. But her voice lacked conviction now. Laura's hands were clenched around the armrest. They're not even hiding it anymore, she said. I heard what you said about who looks VIP. That's your training? Emily froze. The entire row heard it this time. Michael turned his camera on Emily's face. You just admitted that on camera, he said, his voice calm but firm. You said the quiet part out loud. Amara turned back toward the front of the plane. Their bias is clear. David, they're not even trying to hide it anymore. And still, no one from the crew stepped in to stop it. No lead attendant, no supervisor. The silence was as damning as the insults. The story wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about a system. It was about how quickly one complaint, from one entitled man, could tip the scales against someone who had done everything right. Amara followed policy. She dressed the part. She bought the ticket. She smiled, stayed calm, made calls. But none of it mattered because, to some people, she just didn't look like she belonged. And now, even with proof in hand, even with witnesses standing up for her, even with a man filming every second, they were still trying to push her out. But what they didn't know, and what they were about to find out, was that the person on the other end of her phone call wasn't just any husband. He was the CEO of Skyward Airlines, and he wasn't just coming to pick her up. He was coming to pick apart every corner of this operation, starting with the people who thought they could rewrite the rules mid-flight just to please a man in 1C. Sarah's fingers tapped rapidly on her crew-issued tablet, her brows furrowing in frustration as the system repeatedly rejected her attempted override. What she hadn't noticed, or perhaps thought no one else would, was that she had just quietly changed Amara's first-class designation to economy in the flight manifest. Michael, still filming from his row, zoomed in slightly, whispering, "She just altered the ticket right in front of us." The digital entry flashed for a second. Seat 2A changed to seat 19C. And just like that, Sarah turned to Amara with manufactured authority. "Ma'am, you're not authorized to be in this cabin. You've been reassigned. Please move." Amara stared at her, stunned. "You changed my seat just now," she said. "You falsified my record." But Sarah held firm, lifting her chin. "I'm following protocol," she snapped. "You need to cooperate." From the aisle, Emily moved to physically block Amara from stepping toward the window seat she rightfully owned. "You're creating a safety risk," she said flatly, as if reading from a manual. Meanwhile, Richard Hayes leaned out of his seat again with his arms crossed, barking. "Just remove her already. This is insane." The tension in the cabin was thick, like a storm about to crack wide open. Michael's video, now captioned "Skyward's Racism, Live," had exploded past 1 million views, spreading faster than the flight could board. Michael turned the camera on himself briefly and said, "This is racism. Right here. Documented. She paid. They changed her seat. They're trying to remove her like she doesn't count." Laura Bennett, still standing behind Amara, spoke up, her voice louder than before. "You can't just erase a seat assignment because a white man doesn't like who's sitting next to him." Amara raised her phone again. "David, she changed the ticket," she said. "She put me in economy in the system. I saw it happen. I need you here." Her voice cracked slightly for the first time, not from fear, from fury, from the sting of watching people in uniform weaponize authority against her as if dignity were negotiable. More passengers were now standing or shifting in their seats. A few whispered under their breath, a couple of them openly filming with their phones. One woman near row 5 said to her partner, "This is going to hit the news. I guarantee it." Amara refused to budge. "I'm not moving," she said to Sarah, louder now, for everyone to hear. "I bought this seat. I am in my seat." Michael echoed her. "You're not moving." Sarah's voice sharpened. "You are not on the manifest for this cabin," Amara pointed, "because you changed it." Laura stepped closer, almost shoulder to shoulder with Amara, and said to the flight crew, "You realize you're doing this in front of 100 witnesses?" Emily tried again. "Please return to your newly assigned seat." But her voice trembled now. Something had shifted. The cabin no longer felt on their side. Michael turned his phone back toward the aisle. "If they touch her," he whispered to the camera, "this whole airline's going down." One of the younger passengers in coach tweeted a screenshot of the live stream, captioned, "They changed her seat mid-boarding. This is a lawsuit waiting to happen." Hashtags like hashtag Skyward Fail and hashtag First Class Bias started trending. The airline name was in the public crosshairs before the wheels even left the gate. Back in the cabin, Richard was losing patience. "This is absurd," he growled. "She's ruining the flight. You people always act like victims." That phrase, "you people," broke through the remaining silence. A woman in 2C snapped, "Excuse me? That's enough." A man in the bulkhead row stood up. "She's not the one ruining anything. That's her seat. Sit down." Amara turned to Michael, voice low. "They thought I'd just take it, that I'd shrink." Michael nodded, still filming. "But you didn't." Sarah was cornered now. Not physically, but by the weight of public exposure. She looked toward the front of the aircraft as if begging for backup that wasn't coming. Emily stepped closer to the curtain separating first class from coach, but no one emerged to save them. The rest of the crew had clearly decided to keep their heads down. "Ma'am," Sarah said again, one last time. "You need to leave this cabin or face removal." Amara took one deliberate step forward, not away, but toward her rightful seat. "You're done, Sarah," she said softly, but with force. "You don't get to erase people just because someone like him snaps his fingers." Laura echoed her. "You falsified her record. That's a fireable offense," Michael added. "We all saw you do it. It's on video." Sarah didn't respond. She just stood there, clipboard trembling slightly in her hand. Emily tried again to reassert control. "We are asking for compliance. That's it." Amara raised her voice, calm but clear. "And I'm asking for accountability." Richard, still grumbling, leaned back in his seat, fuming that the situation hadn't bent to his entitlement, but the balance of power had shifted. Laura looked at Sarah and said plainly, "You owe this woman an apology. Right now," Michael added. "Better yet, she deserves justice." Sarah was silent. Emily glanced away. Richard scoffed. But the passengers? The passengers were now united, and Amara stood right at the center. By this point, Michael's live stream had hit 2 million views. Clips were being shared across Instagram and YouTube. A former Skyward flight attendant even commented under the original video, "This happened before. I was told to prioritize white men in first. They called it image control." The implications were spreading fast. On the phone, David's voice came through firm and focused. "I'm almost at the gate." Amara didn't flinch. "They tried to erase me," she said, "but they did it in front of witnesses." Then came the moment that sealed it. A second passenger stood up from business class, a young woman in her 20s, visibly shaking. "I have the same app," she said, holding up her phone. "Look, you can change seat assignments with a swipe. It logs the timestamp. She was in 2A. I saw it earlier when I checked." She held the phone high enough for Michael to capture it on camera. The timestamp was clear. The switch had happened 5 minutes earlier, exactly when Sarah had been tapping on her screen. Michael turned back to Amara. "They tried to delete your seat, but the internet's not letting them." Amara looked down for a moment, then back up at the crew. "You humiliated me publicly, but you did it thinking no one would care. Now, the whole world's watching." Just as Sarah opened her mouth again, one of the gate agents appeared in the doorway of the aircraft. He looked flustered, confused, and then suddenly very, very alert. Behind him, a sharply dressed black man in his mid-40s stepped forward. No uniform, but clearly someone in charge. He nodded at the gate agent, who stepped aside without a word. Michael's camera panned to the entrance. "Who's that?" someone whispered. Amara saw him first. Her voice lifted slightly, not in surprise, but in confirmation. "David." Her husband had arrived, and the temperature in the cabin changed completely. The moment David Johnson stepped onto the aircraft, the energy in the cabin shifted like a sudden gust of wind. He wasn't wearing a badge or uniform, but he didn't need one. The way he carried himself said enough. Tailored Navy suit, no tie, calm eyes that scanned the cabin like he already knew what had happened. The gate agent stood awkwardly behind him, silent now, clearly realizing who exactly had just walked past. David didn't say a word at first. He simply looked at his wife, standing proud, shaken but not broken, and gave her a nod that said, "I heard everything." Amara's posture straightened. For the first time in 10 minutes, she exhaled fully. David turned his attention to Sarah Mitchell and Emily Carter. "Amara Johnson is my wife," he said, loud enough for every row to hear. A wave of silence swept through the cabin. You could feel people sit back in their seats, phones held just a little higher. Michael Chen caught it all on camera, the CEO of Skyward Airlines revealing that the black woman his crew had just tried to remove was not only a paying passenger, but married to the man who signed their paychecks. "She paid for this seat," David continued, "and she's going to remain in this seat. Do you understand?" Sarah looked like the ground had just opened beneath her. Emily's jaw tightened. Richard Hayes, in 1C, leaned back like someone had just flipped a spotlight on him. Laura let out a breathy, almost triumphant laugh. "Well, that's a twist," she said under her breath. David walked toward Amara but didn't hug her, didn't interrupt her stance. He let her stay centered, powerful, as she turned to face the crew. "You embarrassed me," she said, voice steady. "Not just in front of this cabin, but in front of the entire internet. You tried to erase me," Sarah stammered. "We didn't know." But Amara cut her off. "That's exactly the problem. You saw my skin, not my ticket, not my name, not my worth." Michael's phone now showed a red notification flashing across the top. 3.8 million views. The comment section was exploding. "Fire them! This is what happens when you judge a book by its color. Skyward Airlines better act fast." Susan Caldwell, head of Skyward's board, had just been tagged in over 400 posts. Richard Ellison, senior compliance counsel, had screenshots flooding his inbox. Karen Liu, the company's HR director, had already left 2 voicemails for David and was waiting at the terminal. Amara faced the crew again. "This isn't just about me. This is about a pattern, and it ends here." Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear. Emily stepped forward and tried to regain control. "We followed protocol. We were trained to—" But Laura interrupted. "To do what? Prioritize passengers who look rich? You said that out loud. I heard you." Another voice from row 4 chimed in. "You told her she didn't belong. In front of witnesses." David stepped forward again. "I've contacted the board. I expect a decision by tomorrow." Sarah tried again. "We only moved her because Richard insisted." But David's stare shut her down. "You don't move a paying customer based on someone's personal bias," he said. "That's not how we operate. Or at least, it's not how we're going to anymore." Richard tried to slink down in his seat, but the spotlight was already on him. Michael turned the camera slightly in his direction. "He's the one who started this," Laura added. "He said she wasn't first-class material." And they listened. Amara stepped forward, her voice measured. "You obeyed the voice of the man complaining instead of honoring the passenger who followed every rule. Why? Because he looked more like what you expected?" A murmur rippled through the cabin. Emily snapped. "You don't understand the training." But that only made things worse. Michael raised an eyebrow. "You're saying the training told you to discriminate?" A few passengers gasped. "We were told to prioritize VIP image," Emily said, almost whispering now, as if she knew she was saying too much. Laura's mouth dropped open. "That's in writing?" Amara looked at David. "We need to see that training manual." Meanwhile, Michael's video was now at 5.4 million views. Someone had clipped Emily's admission and posted it under the hashtag VIP bias. It was spreading fast. In the background, another passenger pulled up a Bloomberg article from last year that mentioned similar complaints against another airline. "It's happening across the industry," the woman said. "But this is the first time someone's being held accountable in real time." David pulled out his phone and tapped a message to Susan Caldwell. "Emergency review required. Policy documents, training modules, and HR protocols." Then he looked up at Emily and Sarah. "We'll be requesting both of your statements, and until further notice, you're relieved of duty." Sarah blinked. "We're fired?" David didn't raise his voice. "You're suspended pending review, but if what I've seen and heard today checks out." "Yes," You will be terminated. Actions have consequences, especially when they threaten the integrity of the brand. Richard Hayes stood up suddenly. I didn't ask for her to be fired, he protested. This is getting out of control. David turned to face him squarely. No, Mr. Hayes, what's out of control is the idea that you felt entitled to dictate who sits beside you, Amara added quietly, and that someone listened. Richard slumped back down. I didn't mean for all this, but no one was listening anymore. Not really. Michael posted the newest video update with the caption, CEO shows up, fires staff on the spot, real leadership in action. His subscriber count had jumped by 3,000 in under 2 hours. Laura turned to Amara. I've never seen anyone stand their ground like that. Amara smiled faintly. It's not the first time, but it's the first time the whole world watched. Back at headquarters, Karen Liu had already started drafting a press statement. Skyward Airlines does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. It would begin. But behind the scenes, bigger conversations were unfolding. David had called for an emergency board meeting. The entire training process was now under scrutiny, and the 2 new hires being quietly onboarded, Lisa Torres and Anna Brooks, would be part of the reform pilot program David was planning to launch. But all of that was still hours away. Right now, in that cabin, justice had arrived, not in the form of shouting or lawsuits, but in the calm, deliberate actions of a CEO who didn't need to flex his title. He just needed to show up. Amara sat down slowly in seat 2A. Finally, Laura helped her adjust the belt. Michael gave her a thumbs up, and David simply stood back, arms crossed, watching as the rest of the cabin settled. For the first time that afternoon, Amara leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes, not because the fight was over, but because, finally, someone had backed her up in real time. And for once, she didn't have to fight alone. As Amara finally settled into her rightful seat in 2A, the tension in the cabin didn't vanish. It shifted. The confrontation had quieted, but no one could unsee what had just happened. David stood calmly beside her row, facing a cabin full of passengers who had just witnessed a moment that was about far more than a seating dispute. For those still unclear, David said, Amara Johnson is my wife, and she has every right to be exactly where she is. That statement rippled through the rows. Sarah Mitchell, who just moments ago had tried to erase Amara's presence, now looked pale and small beneath the weight of what she'd done. Her voice cracked. We didn't know who she was, Emily Carter added. We were just following what we were trained to do. But the excuse rang hollow. It wasn't about titles. It was about how quickly they had judged someone by appearance, and how readily they had sided with a privileged voice over a paying customer. Richard Hayes, the man who had sparked the entire chain reaction, now looked away, arms crossed and silent. He didn't offer an apology. He didn't even try. Michael Chen's phone was still rolling as he captured the fallout. His new video, titled CEO's Wife Denied First-Class Seat, crossed 20 million views before the seatbelt sign even came on. Laura leaned in slightly toward Amara, who remained composed but visibly worn. You just changed the industry, Laura whispered. Amara didn't answer right away. She simply looked up at David and said, You showed them. David, you didn't just show up. You showed leadership. David nodded, but his attention turned immediately to business. He stepped aside and tapped into a secure app on his phone, issuing a directive to Skyward's internal comms team simultaneously. Board members Susan Caldwell and Richard Ellison were patched in for a preliminary briefing. HR Director Karen Liu responded within seconds. A review panel would be assembled. By morning, decisions would be final. But in that moment, Amara wasn't focused on policies. She was focused on justice. She looked Sarah directly in the eye. "I want them fired," she said. "Not just because of what they did to me, but because of what they would have done to anyone else who didn't have a CEO on speed dial." Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but the words never made it out. Emily tried instead. "We didn't mean for this to happen." But Michael cut in, his voice from the row behind now steady and sharp. "It always happens. The difference is this time you got caught." The passengers around them began nodding, murmuring in agreement. Laura added, "She wasn't the first, but she better be the last." As David coordinated the next steps with headquarters, Karen Liu contacted key media outlets to prepare for a tightly controlled narrative. They wouldn't spin it. They'd tell the truth, on the airline's terms, before the internet did it for them. Skyward Airlines confirms an internal investigation is underway following a discrimination incident on board Flight 384. The early statement read, "Meanwhile, Michael's post continued to climb. New captions spread, bias, caught, fired." One user wrote, "This is what accountability looks like when someone powerful actually cares." Another said, "This woman handled herself with more grace than I could have managed. Fired them with her posture alone." But what really fueled the story was the next twist. Sarah, under pressure, admitted. "Richard told us she made him uncomfortable. He said she didn't fit in here." The words spilled out as she tried to distance herself from the final fallout. But it was too late. Emily reached for Michael's phone in a clumsy attempt to stop filming, and Laura physically stepped between them. "Don't you dare," she said. "This story needs to be seen." Amara, now sitting upright with her hands folded in her lap, turned slowly towards Sarah. "You didn't just act on bias. You acted on the request of a man who couldn't stand sitting next to a black woman who dared to look successful." Her voice was low, but it cut through the silence like glass breaking. "You don't get to hide behind training. You had a choice, and you chose to humiliate me publicly." David's voice followed. "Actions have consequences, and if we tolerate this once, it becomes our legacy." He turned to the flight crew and said clearly, "As of this moment, you are both grounded. HR will be in contact. Security will escort you off this plane after landing." From several rows back, another passenger spoke up, a quiet man who hadn't said a word until now. "She stood her ground with more dignity than this airline did." Someone else clapped softly, then a few more. The applause wasn't wild or performative. It was steady, uncomfortable, honest. It didn't celebrate revenge. It acknowledged a wrong finally being made right. Amara looked toward the front of the plane, then back to David. "This isn't over," she said. "There's a system behind this, if you want to fix it. Don't just fire 2 people. Fix the root." David didn't hesitate. "We will." Karen Liu's text buzzed on his screen. Media outlets alerted, training docs being pulled now, bias flagged in onboarding. The process had begun, and for the first time since she walked onto that aircraft. Amara smiled, not out of satisfaction, but out of relief. This wasn't about proving who she was. It was about proving that the culture of quiet injustice, the kind that hides behind policies and tones and false professionalism, could finally be exposed in just 10 minutes. She went from being publicly humiliated to becoming the catalyst for a corporate reckoning, and with millions watching. The message was clear. What happened on this flight was no longer a private incident. It was now part of the public record. The very next morning, in a quiet corner conference room at Skyward Airlines' Chicago headquarters, the real work began. David Johnson sat at the head of a long mahogany table, flanked by board members Susan Caldwell and Richard Ellison, with HR Director Karen Liu on video call from Atlanta. The night before had been long. Media coverage, internal reports, and millions of comments flooding every Skyward platform. But David hadn't slept. Neither had Amara. This meeting wasn't just about damage control, it was about course correction. The facts were laid out clearly. 2 flight attendants had profiled a paying first-class passenger, acted on the biased complaint of another customer, and even falsified her seat assignment in the system. It was all on video, verified by eyewitnesses, confirmed by timestamps, and viewed by over 35 million people across social media platforms. "This isn't just a customer service failure," Susan said firmly. "This is an institutional flaw." Richard nodded. "And it didn't start on that flight. It started with training." Karen Liu, already deep into an overnight audit, shared her findings on screen. A section of Skyward's crew training manual, highlighted in yellow, read, "Prioritize guests who match brand image for first-class presentation." The room fell silent. "Brand image?" David asked. Karen nodded grimly. "In plain English, prioritize white, male, wealthy-looking passengers." David didn't raise his voice. "That language goes today. All of it." The decision was swift. Sarah Mitchell and Emily Carter were terminated immediately. HR documents were finalized, security footage reviewed, and an internal memo was issued. Skyward Airlines has zero tolerance for discrimination, explicit or implicit. The message was shared with all employees, and a copy was included in the press release drafted by Karen's team. The public had been demanding action, and now they were getting it. But David wasn't done. He announced the immediate hiring of 2 new flight attendants, Lisa Torres and Anna Brooks, both women of color with prior leadership experience and spotless service records. They would be placed in first class as part of a pilot equity initiative. In addition, every current crew member would undergo mandatory bias and equity training, with modules designed in partnership with a third-party ethics firm. Amara, though not an employee, volunteered to consult directly on the program. "I don't want what happened to me to ever happen to anyone else," she told David. He nodded. "Then we'll build something better." Karen also arranged for personal apologies to be sent to each passenger who witnessed the incident, including Laura Bennett and Michael Chen. Michael, meanwhile, continued posting updates. His next video, "Skyward Responds, CEO Acts Fast," hit 41 million views in just 12 hours. "This isn't performative," he said in the clip. "It's real change. We saw it start the moment David walked on that plane." Internally, Susan Caldwell praised David's leadership. "You didn't flinch," she said. "You owned it. And you moved," Richard Ellison added. "We'll be auditing every piece of training material from the last 5 years. If there's more bias buried in language, we'll find it." But the most explosive moment came when Karen's audit team uncovered a supplemental crew memo, not in the formal handbook, but shared unofficially via internal chat groups, that advised flight attendants to redirect disruptive guests whose appearance may compromise the premium experience. It was chilling in its vagueness and dangerous in its intent. Karen's voice cracked slightly as she read it aloud. "This wasn't just tolerated," she said. "It was normalized." David stood, walked to the screen, and stared at the line for a long second. Then he said quietly, "We're launching a full investigation. Anyone connected to that language will be held accountable." He turned to Susan. "This isn't about optics. This is about trust." Susan nodded. "And that trust starts with consequences." Outside the boardroom, staff began receiving alerts. A revised training framework was in development. Department heads were instructed to review all onboarding protocols. Flight crews were notified of policy updates. Lisa and Anna, the 2 new hires, received welcome emails with personal notes from David himself. "You're here to help us rebuild something stronger," he wrote. Amara sat in on a strategy call with Karen, offering insights about how bias often hides behind politeness, how the tone of a sentence can convey as much harm as the words. It's not always about shouting, she said. Sometimes it's the quiet dismissal that does the deepest damage. Karen agreed. That's what we're going to fix. As the day closed, the ripple effect of that 10-minute flight encounter was now becoming the foundation of something broader. Skyward wasn't just reacting, it was reforming. The board planned a town hall with employees. Michael's latest video, Skyward Reforms Now, played a clip of Amara saying, "Justice is more than apology, it's policy." And viewers responded. Thousands of comments poured in, one said. "My mother was treated like that on a flight in the 80s. She didn't have a CEO husband. Thank you. Amara," another read. "For the first time. I believe an airline actually listened." 3 months later. The skyline of downtown Chicago shimmered through the windows of Skyward Airlines' top-floor boardroom, where Amara and David Johnson sat side by side. It had been 90 days since that flight. 90 days since Sarah Mitchell had tried to strip Amara of her dignity, since Emily Carter had backed her, since Richard Hayes had sneered that she didn't look like she belonged. But Amara wasn't just seated in first class now. She was helping lead a company-wide transformation from the inside. Skyward had overhauled its training, restructured its hiring practices, and brought in a third-party ethics team to track ongoing compliance. Bias wasn't just a topic in a slide deck, it was something addressed in every crew meeting, every onboarding interview, and every customer policy. The video Michael Chen posted had crossed 50 million views, with captions like "Aviation Transformed" and "From Humiliation to Reform." Passengers who had once flown in silence now shared their own stories, tagging hashtag Skyward Rebuild and citing Amara by name. In that boardroom, David turned to his wife, smiled faintly, and said, "We changed lives. Amara." She nodded. "Together. Always." There was no press around them today, no cameras or headlines, just two people, reflecting on the weight of what they'd survived and the ripple effect that followed. Down the hall, HR Director Karen Liu was leading a session with newly hired flight crews, reviewing real-world bias scenarios and how to handle them with empathy. Not assumption. Michael, now a verified creator across several platforms, had just posted a video update saying, "This is what happens when leadership listens. This is how change happens." And he wasn't wrong. But not everyone had moved on. That afternoon, while Amara was reviewing updates to the airline's internal equity roadmap, she was informed that Sarah Mitchell, now unemployed, had attempted to visit headquarters unannounced. Security intercepted her in the lobby. She wanted to speak to Amara, claiming she deserved to explain her side. But Amara didn't engage. She had said all she needed to say on that plane. As Sarah was escorted out, she shouted that she had only done what the job demanded. Amara, watching silently from the security monitor upstairs, turned away and simply said, "Actions have consequences." It wasn't about vengeance. It was about closure, across the company. Karen Liu had made it clear. The goal wasn't to shame, it was to change. And that change was working. Passenger satisfaction scores had risen. Complaints had dropped. Crew members said they felt more confident handling difficult situations because they were no longer trained to judge by appearance, but to lead with respect, internally. Amara's role shifted from outsider to advisor, becoming the cornerstone of the company's Equity Oversight Council. In meetings, her voice wasn't just heard, it was sought. She had become more than the woman humiliated on a flight. She had become a symbol of what happens when someone chooses to stand firm rather than stay silent. That fall, Amara stood before a room of Skyward employees during the company's first Diversity Leadership Summit. With a calm voice and unwavering posture, she addressed hundreds of staff members and live-stream viewers. "Empathy and accountability rebuild trust," she said. "You can't undo the past, but you can refuse to repeat it." After her talk, dozens of crew members approached her, some with tears, some with gratitude, others with their own quiet confessions of moments when they hadn't spoken up. But wished they had, Karen Lou told her later. You've set a new standard. Even David, who had seen Amara shine countless times in corporate rooms and executive briefings, said softly, I've never been prouder. 1 week later, Amara published an op-ed titled Bias at 3,000 Feet, reflecting on how quiet prejudice becomes normalized in places where politeness masks harm. Leadership isn't just about strategy, she wrote. It's about standing in the gap when someone else's voice is being pushed down. The piece went viral within 48 hours, quoted by airline CEOs, HR consultants, and civil rights advocates. In that same week, a whistleblower came forward, a former HR intern, revealing that complaints similar to Amara's had been filed quietly for years, but were either dismissed or handled internally without consequence. Karen brought the report directly to David and Amara. It was never just your flight, she said. There's been a pattern, and we're going to expose it. Amara read through the complaints, some dating back over a decade, and felt her chest tighten. No more silence, she said. David nodded. We'll keep pushing. And they did. 6 months after the incident, Skyward launched its own aviation bias prevention initiative, a nonprofit funded by the airline and supported by a coalition of other carriers, aimed at eliminating systemic prejudice in air travel across the country. Amara became its public face, delivering the keynote at the National Travel Ethics Conference. What happened on Flight 384 wasn't just a moment, she said. It was a mirror, and we had to decide whether we'd look away or face it. The audience gave her a standing ovation. Back at their hotel later that evening, David poured 2 glasses of wine and sat beside her quietly. To the woman who changed the industry, he said. Amara smiled. To the passengers who refused to stay quiet, they raised their glasses, not in celebration, but in resolve. Because for them, this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of doing things right.